Good morning. So nice to see so many joining us, even though I only see squares. We'll get started in just a second. I'm watching the waiting room. When you see me looking up there, just to make sure I get people in. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just kick things off so we can get right to our panelists and moderator into today's event. On behalf of ACHE, I am so happy to see so many people here today. We welcome you. And on behalf of the ACHE of Indiana, welcome to this presentation that they are providing for us today. Quick things I want to just discuss regarding your credit. So this does get 1.5 of the virtual interactive credit. We did this a little differently. A lot of you probably just joined through the Zoom link. So if your name doesn't match what you would have registered with, if you could change it for me, please. And if you don't know how to do that, let me know or reach out to me in the chat and say, my screen name says this, but I registered as this so that I can make sure we get that to ACHE so we get your credits correctly given to you. We are recording the event. That will be in the Learning Management System, ache.org, in about 2 business days. So if you do want to watch any of this again, feel free. Also, you will see an evaluation link in the chat. That evaluation link is very important. So we really ask that you go ahead and complete that. You can also find that in the course section on the Learning Management System. You also will see it right at the end. I promise I will post it right at the end so you can grab it then before you leave the session. Any questions that you have as you're going through today's presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. We will address them as we can. We also have time at the end for Q&A. If you'd prefer to raise your hand and ask a question, come off mute, you're able to do that as well. So I think I covered everything. If I missed anything, panelist or Andrew, let me know. But I am going to turn it over to today's moderator, Andrew Van Zee, who's going to get us started. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Nancy. So we're excited to welcome you all today to our first virtual education event of the year for our chapter, Effective Strategies in Crisis Leadership. You'll notice that the chapter is offering more virtual events throughout the year with hopes to be able to really expand our educational offerings to our entire membership across the state. We have an exciting panel today, and here briefly, I'll introduce themselves, allow them to introduce themselves. Just to give you background, my name is Andrew Van Zee. I am the president-elect of ACHE of Indiana, as well as in my day job, serve as vice president of regulatory and hospital operations for the Indiana Hospital Association. Want to thank our sponsors of ACHE of Indiana. Without them, we would not be able to bring these educational opportunities to our membership. Our platinum sponsors, Blue & Company and HEPE. Our gold sponsors, Cornerstone and Access Telecare. Our silver sponsors, Arc Design and Ascension St. Vincent. Our bronze sponsor, Hagerman Construction, and our educational sponsor, Walden University. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel today. We have Amanda Nath Matchett, who serves as the Chief Nursing Officer of IU Health Adult Academic Health Center. Brian Barrick, who serves as the Chief Strategy Officer at Eskenazi Health. And Kathy Cadle, Senior Vice President and Director of Public Relations with Doe Anderson. So with that, I will allow each of them to kind of give their kind of description of their background, their current role, and why kind of this concept of crisis leadership, what really draws them to this topic. So I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning, everyone. So glad to be with you today. As Andrew said, I'm Amanda Nath Matchett. I serve as the Vice President and Chief Nursing Officer at IU Health Adult Academic Health Center, which consists of 2 adult hospitals in downtown Indianapolis, Methodist Hospital and University Hospital. I've been with the organization for 15 years, started as a staff nurse at University Hospital, and have served in a variety of progressive leadership roles over the course of my tenure. In my role as Chief Nursing Officer, have responsibility for the delivery of patient care across both settings, in our inpatient setting as well as our emergency department. So during my time, have been able to lead through a variety of different crises and work with our team through the successful navigation of those. So excited to share more with you today and learn from you as well, because I know this is something that we all have experienced and have experiences to share.
Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. My name's Brian Barrick. I serve as Chief Strategy Officer at Eskenazi Health. We are a roughly 350-bed acute care facility located downtown Indianapolis with ambulatory locations focused on behavioral health and primary care, all within Marion County. I've worked in healthcare. It's been about 20 years now. Sorry about that. And been at Eskenazi Health for about 8. I'm responsible for strategic planning, project management, business development, design, construction, and our performance improvement efforts across the health system. Thanks for having me.
All right, Kathy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kathy Cadle. I've been in healthcare communications and marketing for about 29 years, both on the health system side and now on the agency side. I am PRSA certified, which is Public Relations Society of America certified in crisis communications and reputation management. So my POV today will be about the crisis comms piece of crisis leadership and how that should integrate with crisis response. And thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Kathy. So, as mentioned, if you have questions as we kind of discuss this topic, please write those in chat. We will have an opportunity at the end, but we may also incorporate some of those questions as part of the discussion. We've really broken up the discussion today in kind of 3 parts as far as, how to, initially prepare for crisis, what to do as far as responding to a crisis, and then kind of the post-crisis management and follow-up. And so, with that, I guess as we kind of lead off, I'll open up to the group. What are some of the structures in place that your organizations have or that you've seen other organizations use to kind of help pre-identify what are those potential crises? And I guess maybe even kind of list out what are the different crises. I think there's many crises that, obviously we see on kind of the front page of the newspaper or in the news, but also kind of what are some of those crises maybe behind the scenes as we start to talk about the crises within healthcare. So I'll open up to the panel for discussion.
Sure. I guess I'm the first one off mute, so I'll get that started. So far as structures in place and the clients I work with on crisis preparation, we generally use the incident command team structure, or assume that that's the structure that they are using for their crisis preparedness, and then we write the crisis communications plan to hold hands with that structure. And the crisis communications plan should clearly define roles and responsibilities for specific members of the communications and management staff by both name and title. They should have clear and concise processes to ensure the timely flow of information, to speed decision-making. That's a big one. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. Responses, message development, and delivery to key audiences. And internal is always first. We'll come back to that, especially depending on the kind of crisis. Crises are always internal first. And the plan needs to guide the team both from first response. There's usually a section for the first 48 hours, and then all the way through long-term recovery and mitigation and review. So our plans are pretty comprehensive in that way. The ICT and the comms plan, this is the biggest part. A lot of comms plans get written, put in a nice binder, and put on a shelf, and they're never looked at again until there's a crisis. So we recommend and kind of insist on at least annual review, practice review, and then edit. And that's how we do that. Our most successful clients usually do 2 trainings a year, one with the ICTs. Usually it's a table drill, and we do one alongside them as one team, and then we do one separately because I like to be particularly evil and do real-time decision-making and put we try to get participants in the headspace of a crisis, and so they have to get used to making decisions under duress. So we update it regularly. For instance, we updated all of our clients' plans after COVID, because most of the plans assumed kind of a war room where everyone would be together and working in that space. And then during COVID, it became clear everyone could work separately. And it's really about, those drills are about process and relationship. It's much better to say, oh, for this piece of information, I need to call Andrew, and not for this piece of information, I need to call the vice president of whatever, whoever that is. And so the point of all of that is to reduce the mental load that people participating in the crisis leadership and crisis management have during crisis, to try to develop as much muscle memory as possible for communications folks, so they're not staring at a blank screen wondering what in the world they're supposed to say. So if you haven't figured it out by now, I'm a huge advocate of getting those plans in place and practicing in advance. And so far as determining what kinds of crises you might need to prepare for, really that's getting those same people together and in a session and coming up with kind of the worst case scenarios for everybody, and then planning, making sure your plan can be used in all of those. And then if needed, you put together scenario plans for some that might be outliers. So that was a lot. I'll be quiet.
I think that was great, Kathy, and just want to build off of what you said. I think it is so important to really clearly define the roles and responsibilities of the incident command team. One of the things that we really have noticed, so we have a little shy of 900 beds split across our 2 campuses, level 1 trauma center, so very busy, lots of things going on. And really what we found is that we needed to identify a structure for that early identification of what can turn into a crisis, right? So before we even get into activation of incident command, what's our escalation structure? Because we have a large footprint and we need to be able to make sure that we're tied in and tapped into that timely escalation. So we've spent a fair amount of time refining different structures, and a lot of that has involved a leader on call structure. So how can we make sure that we really have clearly defined who gets to make the call and what's the chain of command, so that we know when we're activating incident command, it's for the right things, right? What can we resolve in real time versus what do we really need to pull that incident command team together? One of our big learnings recently has been broadening that pool of who can serve in what we call our administrator on call group. Traditionally, it had been more of our clinical operational leaders, and we've actually expanded recently to some of our non-clinical operational leaders. We've had a lot of great wins from that. And so by bringing them in, we do a lot of extensive training before we put them on call, especially without a clinical background. We also partner them with a clinical partner, especially as they're learning that administrator on call role. But that has really given us some fresh eyes, and it's allowed us, to your point, Kathy, to really make sure that we are having good written roles and responsibilities in advance and really clearly defining what needs to be escalated, how we resolve things. And so that's been a big win for us. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at that. Make sure you're diversifying your pool of leaders that can serve in that role, because I think that's been a win to the organization. We also have really, through that structure, made sure that we know what the timely escalation process looks like. So our administrators on call and our executives on call are very connected into our tiered huddle process. We have a daily tiered huddle throughout all levels of our organization where we can very quickly escalate in pretty close to real time issues that are bubbling up. So whether those are clinical issues that need a broader team to resolve, or we have old buildings, and so sometimes we have facilities issues that need to be escalated and quickly addressed. And so that tiered huddle structure allows us to say, we're surveilling the environment, we're really monitoring this, here's something that could cause a problem down the line. And so I think that's another thing too. What are your daily processes that allow you to really investigate what's happening in the environment, so that hopefully you can prevent a crisis from occurring and get into that sooner rather than later?
Well, I don't. So the fun thing is, I think we leveraged kind of a combination of what Amanda described and what Kathy described. So I think a crisis in terms of kind of proactive response and then reactive response. So we also leverage the incident command system. We have designated roles and responsibilities, and those individuals are required to complete training annually relative to their job functions in that structure. See, Amanda mentioned AODs. So we require our AODs to go through annual training to make sure that they are well prepared in case something happens. And then they're also empowered to pull together, at least start incident command in the event that something serious happens. And we've erred on that side of we'd rather get around something early and then scale back a command center versus wish that we would have started that immediately and then something snowball and get out of control. I think the other piece is just as leaders, we have a responsibility to escalate concerns as things happen in the world, to alert others to, hey, there is this thing going on in the environment of healthcare that we need to think about as a leadership team and react to, where it's not the sewage break, that happened overnight. It's we're not going to have enough nurses to do our work in 5 years. So I think a kind of the split between the two of there's the big issues that are just bombarding us every day that we have to be open and honest and have a safe space to talk about as a leadership team. And then there's when something breaks and it's completely unexpected, how do you make sure people are prepared to respond to that real time?
So Brian, you talk about, kind of two different perspectives. And so how do you differentiate, I guess, in kind of in your plans for things that are kind of unforeseen, such as like a flooding of a department or a portion of the hospital, or maybe even access to the hospital versus, kind of the known industry risks, such as staffing or cyber incidents, that are more of an expected kind of crisis that may be more of an everyday or just a matter of time. How do your plans or communication plan, both operational and kind of communication plans, differentiate between those, or do you treat them the same?
I think I can probably set Kathy up here. I think so much comes down to communication. So when we get into the incident that happens real time and we need to respond, we're hoping we've trained people enough to where that training kicks in and they just automatically start to do the right things. And you've got to do a lot of practice up front to get there. But I think when it comes down to here are the things impacting all of us, I think that turns into a communication need of people need to understand about the issue. They need to understand who is thinking about the issue. What are we proactively doing? And it's almost more of a how do you get ahead of things to avoid the escalation that doesn't just adds to noise of things you're trying to troubleshoot real time. But Kathy can probably speak to that better than I can.
From your mouth to God's ears, Brian. Communication is the key when you're in a vacuum. People, tend to wander and assume the worst, both externally and internally. So, training and empowering your senior communicators to do the right thing, trusting their training, is really key to all of that. And trusting the communicators that they've made the internal relationships that they need to pull the whatever subject matter experts they need. Mostly they should come from the ICT, obviously, but if they need some context from others, they should have those great internal relationships to be able to provide context needed for the communications that they provide.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Kathy. I would also add a couple things that come to mind for me are thinking about how you're leveraging your business continuity planning. And so what does that process look like? How often are you refreshing your BCPs and making sure that they aren't over focused in one area? That's one thing that we've found as we've looked at them. Sometimes they're heavily focused in things that we know to be disruptors or expect to be disruptors, but what are some of those other things that are out there? And so really scanning the industry, staying connected, and also scanning outside of industry. What are other industries seeing as disruptors that might impact healthcare, things we need to plan for? I also think this is where your strategic planning process really comes into play. And so how are you leveraging your strategic plan to build towards those future risks and to create space for innovation so that we can disrupt some of those cycles or get ahead of them, as Brian and Kathy mentioned, and really being intentional there and building out that culture of, really pulling through your high reliability principles around preoccupation with failure. it's going to break. How is it going to break? How can we actively be poking holes in things and really trying to be intentional about looking where things will fail and then being able to be proactive and put a process in place?
So Kathy, we've talked a lot about communications being a key component, especially I think both on the preparation side as well as you start to move into responding to the crisis. How do organizations really go about, I guess, establishing an effective communication plan to ensure that there's kind of clear messaging within their teams, with leadership, and then maybe more importantly, with externally with media and the community?
Right. That's a really great question. And so that's where the crisis communications plan really comes into focus. The crisis communication plans that we do really cover enough to where they can be used in any event. For instance, ours, and I've got one pulled up here. We always include a messaging matrix, which helps build both internal and external responses depending on, is the safety issue? Is it one where we need to talk about compassion? Is it one that needs to provide direction to help people communicate fully and completely and clearly, depending on the audience they're going with? We've got protocols for internal, social, website, switchboard, response to requests, news conferences, internal, but thinking through all of those potential communications channels you might need, having protocols for how to set those up, who is needed, what's needed, and who's in charge of those. All super important. But I think one of the biggest issues, Andrew, is you put together these plans both from an operational and a communications standpoint, and we really need the people on this call, those senior executives, to either be participating fully in the planning and the drills and knowing, having insight into how all of those decisions are being made in real time so they can trust them. Or if they don't have time or inclination to still trust that the people in place will act on the institution's behalf in a professional way. Because some of the, at least from a communication side, some of the biggest blunders we've seen are where well-meaning senior executives step in and start second guessing without knowing the preparation and all the whys behind some decisions are being made, or the whys behind certain statements should go out when and where and how. So I guess this is my call for senior leaders to really be engaged in all parts of the planning so that they can either trust and empower the decision makers, or engage enough to be the decision maker in real time and know how that's kind of different than your day-to-day decision making.
I think that is such a good point, Kathy. I just want to amplify that. I think it's really critically important to make sure you have the right team that's participating in it, and then trust the team and really empower them. I also think with some of the communication, especially from the senior executive or the senior leader, really remembering that you set the tone and that the team is going to look to you to pick up, should I panic? Do we have everything in place? And so that seems so foundational, but I think it's really critically important. I've seen some cases where the communication can get a little out of sync, and then where there's an absence of information, people are going to make up their own narrative. So I think really creating structures and being consistent with the timing of communication, even if you don't have an update, being authentic and telling people, we don't have an update yet, but we're continuing to work on X, Y, and Z, and we'll cascade communication when we can, really helps to build that trust. And I think that consistency over time builds trust with the team and is really important. Especially when you're dealing with a longer term crisis situation, we found a lot of power into bringing challenging conversations out in the open. So when you know these shadow conversations are happening, or there's rumor in the environment, addressing them directly, especially as a senior leader, and bringing them out into the open to say, hey, let's talk about it. If I don't have the answers, I'll get you the answers, really helps to calm the team, to quell some of the different conversations that are happening, and can get everybody back focused on what needs to be done, which is ultimately taking care of patients.
I love that. And just to one point that I wanted to make, that setting the tone thing, part of our training is when we have people make calls and do their call tree, we work on your tone of voice, like how, and your tone of voice also in emails, how as leaders you disseminate crisis related information is super important. And if you sound panicked, if you look panicked, then you're exactly right, Amanda. Then panic's going to just rush right on down the line.
I'll just add that I think everything Amanda noted on trust becomes super important, because even with the best laid plans and preparation, the pandemic threw things at us that we never could have planned on or been prepared for. We had a cyber event that we never could have prepared for the extent of how we were going to be impacted. And then what you have left is that communication and trust to keep people engaged in a solution and a path forward.
So as we've talked about, like kind of some of these, the development of plans and the training of the plans. So where do you see organizations keeping these plans and making them accessible? And especially as we are now not necessarily always in the four walls of the organization, whether it be a hospital or other kind of physician practice or other healthcare organization. How do you disseminate this information and make it readily accessible?
At Eskenazi Health, our information that supports these efforts is kept on our intranet, and then we also have it pre-printed and ready in binders. We kind of have a kit that we can pick up and take to a command center when we need it. And we do both because, we hope the majority of the time we can get everything off the intranet, that the network is up and running, that we have power, all the things that we need to have access to that. But then we've also prepared for the worst case of if you don't have access to computers, all the things that can happen, that we still have those tools available to us and ready to go at a moment's notice.
Yeah, I love that. We have clients that use intranet. Some have different apps. A lot use whatever work process systems they have in place, whether it's Slack or some use Muckrack, some, all of that. But I want to underscore what Brian said, having that written binder as well that has been updated every time that the internet is updated is super important. Also, one of the command centers that we were training in, because it was the real command center, was in the basement level of the facility, and the Wi-Fi didn't work. They had electricity and all of that, but so still like planning for and thinking through all those eventualities and doubling up your backup systems, super important.
Yeah, I agree. I think that doubling up backup systems is really important, and making sure that people can get to things when they're offsite as well, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier. A lot of times our incident command teams were built on the premise that everyone would come into a single location. But if you either can't get there, or if you're trying to manage, in real time on your way in, making sure that there are connections in a way that is safe and secure, but how can you get access to that information in real time, I think is also really important.
Well, as we kind of transition into responding to a crisis and kind of maybe some of the best practices, can you share, an example of either a crisis you've managed or worked with an organization? What were some of the biggest challenges and how did you navigate those?
I can start. And I think what's most memorable for me is the cyber event we had a couple years ago. And I think what is most memorable about it for me is that we were completely offline for an extended period of time. And that was the piece that I don't think anybody could have been prepared for. So I'll just add a little context. We were perpetrated through a user account, through a third party. There was an extended period where bad players had access to some information. We caught it, shut it off, but then what you don't hear about on the news when this happens is you have to go through the process of what potentially did those bad players leave behind? And how do we make sure everything is safe before we flip things back on and restore connections? And that was the piece that took us down for an extended period. And when you go overnight from everything being done electronically to now you can't even turn on the EMR, it's a hard situation to prepare for. And then you compound that with, well, how long do we live in this space? And nobody has an answer yet. So for us, I think what was most interesting was both for the pandemic and that event, we committed to our team members that we wanted to make sure we could still pay everybody and keep everybody busy with work. I think that went a long way to make people feel engaged and be part of the solution versus be in this headspace of how does this impact me and what is it going to mean for my bills and all the things that are important to me personally. But then we had to assign people tasks to run lab results, like the kind of stuff that we haven't done for years and years and years. All of a sudden we were back. So I think for me, it was we did have to get everybody in one room. We couldn't communicate outside of telephone. And it was just working through problems as they came up. And thankfully, we had a lot of team members that were willing to roll up their sleeves and run the lab results to the clinic down the street, go and pick up the x-ray from radiology and deliver it to the doctor upstairs. And it was, I think it feels like they feel like trivial tasks, but we ended up in a position that was the only way for us to operate. So I'm very thankful for our teams and their willingness just to roll up their sleeves and chip in. But I also think we only got that response because up front we said, we're going to take care of everybody. Nobody needs to worry about their hours being cut or not getting paid. We're going to put everybody to work doing other stuff. And we did that during the pandemic too, and it seemed to pay off for us.
Yeah, I think that is such a good point, Brian. And really, sometimes I think that's something that's omitted when you think about crisis planning, right? We think about activating a labor pool, but what if your labor pool has people that are not traditionally in any type of, patient care facing role or within the walls of the hospital? That's one learning that we also had during the pandemic that we've carried forward as we plan for crises. How do you redeploy people? What are the things that you need to do to quickly orient them to the clinical environment? And then in what ways can they be able to jump in and help support? Because a lot of times your clinical leaders that are also helping to respond to the crisis have trouble thinking quickly through, okay, what can I have this person do? So I think it's really helpful to have a pre-populated list of here's tasks that they can do, here's ways that they can support patients and families, here's ways that they can assist with communication, especially when our traditional structures come apart. The other thing that I would recommend, because we really have started to include this in our planning as well, is how do you think about non-traditional roles? So when your EMR goes down and you have to convert to paper charting, especially for an extended period of time, we found with our workforce being not familiar with paper charting, there's a learning curve. And so can you tap on people that are maybe retired or in a different role that have familiarity with those downtime resources and things like that can even come into the environment and be that at the elbow resource? Because that's one thing that we've found people really struggle with. And it can just add to the chaos if they're not familiar with it. So the training is really important, but then also, are there kind of creative at the elbow approaches that you can bring people into the environment to help provide support?
The one thing I would add to both of these that we've seen both with clients and just as I monitor these type of events across the country when they happen is those beyond internal and just functionality during especially a cyber event, that's a time where trust can quickly erode with patients when we don't know if you have an appointment because do we need to cancel it? Are my records safe? Is my data safe? Especially when you're dealing with some bad actors. And you might have a legal team that doesn't ever want to say anything. And so they're shutting the comms down, which just erodes trust further. So again, part of the planning is when you're thinking about now that cyber events are more and more common, coming to agreement between the legal team, between IT, and communications and operations. These are the things, no matter what, we feel like we could say or address with our external audiences, with our patients and their families, with the news media, to try to keep that trust alive. Because we all know that trust once lost is really difficult to regain. So that's another important piece. And Amanda, to your point of assigning people to answer the phones when the patients are used to making their appointments online, and making sure they've got the right personality to be working with upset patients a lot. Those things that seem small become huge, because you know what, the patients are still online and they're still on social media and saying whatever their experiences that they're going to amplify those externally.
So Kathy, you just mentioned social media. We've seen, a growing kind of both power of social media, both from a positive and maybe a negative standpoint. How do social media crises play into this? How do you how do you respond to it? How do you, maybe use social media effectively to help address the crisis?
Sure. Well, for the first thing, we normally tell clients, healthcare and other industries too, who call us in a social media crisis, is we immediately turn on social listening tools to really get a handle on how big is this crisis, because it's always going to feel huge when it's about you. But using a tool, we use NetBase Quid here, to figure out, is this a pretty insular group that are worked up among themselves, but all of the messages you're getting are just among each other? That's important to know. Or is it 40% of women age 30 to 60 are upset in your main market? Those are big differences in how you might address those. So that's the first thing, is to use data to determine the scope of the crisis, because they all feel huge. And from then we determine, okay, is this something that we just let die out because it's this one group and let them knock themselves out and not respond? Or if it's larger, then you have to get into messaging. But that messaging, you never want to say anything that isn't true. So, okay, what are they saying that's true that we need to address operationally, and that we can promise we've addressed, and keep those promises? If it's misinformation, then facts don't always win arguments online, but you start trying to chip away with positive messaging and truth to tackle that. And depending on what it is, sometimes the answer isn't on social media; it's in other community engagements that you can win folks over. So there's no one, unfortunately, way to approach, but kind of the common denominator is really identifying the size, the scope, and the source of the problem.
Amanda, Brian, go ahead.
I'll just add, you want to make sure too you have good social media policies that you can lean on all the time.
Yeah.
And those become even more important when there's some sort of crisis, because you want to be consistent. And there's the piece of leveraging your marketing communication team to kind of proactively engage the community and keep them informed. But then you also have the underpinnings of something goes south, and then you get the team member that says everything at work's a mess. And you need to have the policy already in place to engage that team member and leverage the appropriate HR policies. So I think consistency and the things that we do when things are not a mess are just as important to carry over into these times of crisis and be consistent in approach.
100%.
So, we talked about, I guess, once you're in the crisis, the coordination of the team and kind of your internal stakeholders, such as legal teams, leadership, operational teams, all these who may have a differing risk tolerance. So how do you align kind of decision making, under pressure while you're in kind of the throes of the crisis?
I'm interested in Amanda's thoughts because we both have the incident command system in place, but I think we're able to, from my viewpoint, we're able to talk about some of the nuance of this because we have those command center systems in place. We're not talking about infighting amongst our leaders, or lack of clarity on who does what when something happens. And I think the reason we're not talking about those things is because we've laid a system and process in place for that. When this happens, here's how this is going to work. And in my experience, that helps a lot, just with what you just mentioned, Andrew, in terms of how do you manage set expectations. And I know from our standpoint, it is 100% understood that the incident command is on point when anything like this happens. And I think that helps myself and other senior leaders engage folks who don't play nice in that space, and kind of address it right away. But I mean, I'm curious what you've seen on your end in this space.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said, right? I think really that clear delineation of who has the final authority on decision making and really respecting that incident command structure. That's why you put it in place. And so making sure that the decisions are aligned with the structure. I think the other thing too, part of it goes back to what we talked about earlier and building relationships ahead of time, right? And so making sure either, through your process where you're running those mock drills or those tabletop exercises, practicing those challenging conversations, I think is important so that when you get into the heat of the moment, it's not personal. It's really about how do we make the best decision for the organization. And with that, I think really remembering that the role of those groups is to advise you on risk. That's their responsibility. They have to make sure that here are the key risks, but then helping to understand what is the impact, right? Here's the risk, but what's the impact if we don't do X, Y, and Z, right? If we're not able to, Kathy's point earlier, to communicate with patients, right? There's a risk that we might say something that, could possibly be damaging, but also we run the risk of damaging trust. And then ultimately it's up to that incident command team to balance those and to balance the impact and make the right decision. So I have seen some groups get wrapped up when they aren't really understanding of people's roles, that the role is to advise on risk. It's not to make the decision for you. So who is ultimately the decision maker? How do you take all of those inputs? How do you synthesize them and come out with the best decision for the organization?
I love that, Amanda. There's risk to taking an action, and there's also risk to not taking the action, and balancing those, and those relationships are super important. And from a communications standpoint, the natural friction, again, not personal, but just decision wise, is usually when both communications and legal are advising on the risks of action and inaction. That tends to be where it is. So working out in advance, can we always say our organization is committed to safety? Can we always say whatever? And working out in advance, what can we always say no matter what's going on? And that's a way to kind of get that conversation going, because yes, there are always risks from a legal perspective to opening your mouth any place, anytime, anywhere. But there's always that erosion of trust that we already talked about if you don't. So finding that common ground is, it can be tricky, but it's certainly achievable.
So as you're, I guess, going through the process of kind of, responding to a crisis, what is the process as far as tracking some of those decisions, tracking what's been done, who's doing what, who's responsible, and kind of creating that kind of documentation in real time of the response?
I think one of the beauty of the incident command system is that those roles are defined where the areas are responsible for capturing that information for reference at a later date. We even have pre-printed forms ready to go to capture specific data points relative to decision making. So a good example is we have a finance section within our incident command whose purpose is to understand the expense associated with the crisis, understand where those dollars are posting and hitting the organization. And then we can use that at a later date, that if we need to pull all those expenses together and capture it and connect it back to the emergency, that we can. And there's that same level of diligence in each of the roles and areas to make those notes, capture those notes. I also think, Andrew, like a big piece of this is the lessons learned after an event, just because that's going to shed light on Were there any roles that struggled, during the course of the incident? Was there any documentation that was lacking during the course of the incident? But thankfully, I think that incident command structure captures a lot of this information as it's spelled out. It's just a question of, did the roles do what they were intended to do during the actual crisis?
I think that's such a good point, Brian, and just want to touch on that piece as you think about really, I found it so important to capture why decisions are made. A lot of times we capture the decision that's made, especially in our incident command structure. Sometimes we don't capture the context. And so when you go to do your hot wash or your debrief after the situation, which I've also found you have to do that as close to the conclusion of the crisis as possible. If you let too much time go, people forget some of that context. So making sure you're documenting, here's why we made the decision. Is it this was the best information we had available at the time? Because when you do that hot wash or debrief process, sometimes you look back and, okay, why did we do that? Or, why was this decision made? And maybe this wasn't the right role to make this decision, but this was what was happening. I will say the other this is small, but this is something we've learned. Don't let people walk out of the room with handwritten notes, because you will never get them back. And oftentimes people are scribbling on Post-its or they're writing on the back of something. Make sure you have someone that is at the door collecting all of those notes, because it is so important to have that as you're really looking at how do we plan for the next event, or what are some of the things that were top of mind in the moment that maybe we didn't capture on the forms because we didn't think to include them. And then you can learn and iterate for the next time.
100%. And that regrouping, I love that. I'd never even thought about the don't let people leave with handwritten notes. How important a tip is that? But that regroup after the incident is over is so important, and dedicating time like that. And that's a mandatory meeting. It's not an hour. It's a good half day, full day. Let's walk through minute by minute, and only kind of by reliving step by step what happened are you really able to capture everything. And then this is the natural time to update your incident plan and to update the contacts and all of that. And that's, find out where the holes were, and then be more prepared for next time.
So as we kind of move into, I guess, kind of the post-crisis and kind of those lessons learned and after action kind of reports, what have been some of the key lessons that you've learned in some of the kind of responses that you've seen within your organization?
I think one thing we've learned is, just some of those pieces like we just talked about, right? Keep the debrief as close as possible. The other thing that I think is really important is to make sure that you have those crisis response resources from an emotional and mental health perspective available for a sustained period of time, because a lot of times we'll have those resources during the immediate crisis, depending on what it is. But people process differently, and people have different timelines for how they work through that. So making sure that people know how they can access those things, and then especially encouraging your leaders to participate, because a lot of times leaders bear an increased front of responsibility. And I know we're not always great about taking care of ourselves as leaders. And so really making sure that we also are tapping into those resources, not only just for ourselves personally, but also it helps to lead by example and to show that that's an important part of the post-crisis recovery period. So that's something that I'm a huge advocate for. We have to really make sure that we have those available to people.
Like, to piggyback off of that, it's having limits of how many days, consecutive days somebody serves in one of these roles, because as leaders, we feel like we have to own so much of this and be present and visible and be tough and good examples for the people that are working with us. But if we're not following the same rules that we're enforcing, then we're not setting good examples. And I saw a comment in the chat about just how do you start to spread this? I really think you just about have to say somebody can serve 3 days on, and then they have to have a set amount of time off before they're back in the command center filling these roles. And then the responsibility becomes on the organization to make sure you have a big enough bench to support that, because otherwise people will wear themselves out.
Absolutely. In the plans we write, we kind of, Brian, to your point about the bench, we have the primary and then a secondary for every single role, for those that are going to last more than a couple of days. Cyber event is going to last a while. A major incident, an explosion, or something, those types of things are going to last a while. And you're both absolutely right. And from a communication standpoint, it's great to have a consistent spokesperson the whole time, but a fried, no sleep spokesperson is not going to represent the institution very well. So making sure that you've got that backup is super important. And then the other lesson learned, one we've talked about several times, is trusting the training, trusting your planning, and trusting the process. And as much as it's tempting in the moment to go with your gut and to take action, one thing we've seen a lot is, oh, I see this thing that needs to be done, and I'm a team player, so I'm going to do it. Well, someone else might be already in the process of doing it or whatever. And then all of a sudden you've got multiple resources working on the same task, whether it's comms or operational, and that can cause confusion and delay. So sticking with the plan and breathing and slowing down, which sounds counterintuitive, but slowing your brain down enough to follow the plan is super important.
So, each of you kind of talked about building out the bench. And so, what are maybe some of the best practices for both, I think, education with respect to the incident command system, and how do you ensure that you have a deep enough bench, or ensure that there is even enough players to put on the court at the time when the incident occurs? Because typically a lot of these incidents don't occur at 9 a.m. when everyone's in the facility or in the organization. You've got vacations and other life issues that sometimes the best laid plans don't exactly work out. So how do you build, I guess, the structure to ensure that you have adaptability with respect to that bench?
I'll jump in just to say that crises only happen when the most trained leader of the ICT is on vacation in Southeast Asia. That's literally the only time they happen. But that's a good point. So I would say, depending on the size of your team, you may not be able to train more than one backup for each role. But that's where having a clear and beautiful plan written is so important, so that if someone needs to step in the moment, they've got a clear plan. And even if they haven't been through the training, they at least can follow along with, these are what my responsibilities are. And the rest of the trained team is there to help make sure that they're on track.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Kathy, and really being intentional about who are those people that can be the backups. And then, to your point, Andrew, how do you get them the training? I do feel like it never fails when you're out or away, something happens. I know I've been, at conferences trying to get back and trying to, help listen into different things. So it is so important to have those different roles. And I know I mentioned earlier about how we've expanded our administrator on-call program. That's been really helpful for us to widen our bench. And so we did look at some of those kind of non-traditional roles within our hierarchy. A lot of times I see organizations just go down their traditional hierarchy. Okay, here's the chief nurse, and then the next level, and that's going to be this piece. But as we've added in others and given them some additional exposure to the clinical environment, that helps prepare them to then be able to be part of that team, again, with the appropriate exposure, the appropriate training, the appropriate background. But then that's helped us to diversify our bench and really have more people that we can rotate in and out. And so that's something I think people should consider. Don't just look within kind of those traditional silos, but are there other groups that you can bring in, give them the exposure ahead of time so that they're familiar with the environment? You don't want them to be jumping in for the first time during a crisis, but how can you really bring them along, partner them with other individuals so that you have a broader group to pull from?
Yeah, I'll just add that we also look on how we can play off of strengths, individual strengths, to align them with the roles and responsibilities in the incident command system. So we have several individuals from finance lined up, trained, and ready to go to support the financial function. Logistics, we get into supply chain and some of those areas, but we've been intentional about trying to align people's day-to-day and their comfort with some of that work with the roles in incident command. Additionally, our administrator on duty, we have one every day. They serve 1 week and then we rotate. They're empowered to start the command center. So that means we always have somebody on site that can initiate incident command response. And then at that point, our senior leadership team would get engaged. we would start to figure out how we need to expand, what roles are in the command center. But we've never kind of left the ship without a captain in that regard. We can always trigger the incident command. It's just then we got to find the right players, the right individuals to staff it.
One of the questions that came through chat, where does media training fit into the overall process? Do you spend time training executive leaders on how to engage and work with external media? And maybe how far down within the organization do you typically go with this type of training?
Sure, that's a great question. Typically, we recommend that every member of the C-suite should be media trained and specifically crisis media trained, so that no matter where a crisis, what area crisis might affect, you've got the senior leader kind of ready to go. But then also in our crisis communication planning, we have the on-the-spot media training that we do, that basically runs through the basic structure of putting together key messages. We've got responses, kind of canned responses to give to keep folks, to keep reporters and media on message, on task. Little bridging statements like, that's a good point. However, the important thing we're talking about today is that type of thing. So, but depending on the crisis, hopefully your lead communications person can serve as the interim check-in spokesperson. And then for big news conferences and big check-ins, and this crisis has been resolved, that's when we'll go to the C-suite, the trained C-suite respondent.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Kathy. Who are your communicators? We talked about social media policies earlier. I think it's also really important to have a clearly written media policy and remind team members about that, especially when you have something that's going on, especially if it's longer term. Who is authorized to speak to the media, who is not, what should they do if somebody approaches them, because we've had to help people through that situation when they're approached walking to their car after their shift or things like that. So just having timely reminders for people about what that looks like and what information they can and cannot cascade.
That's a really good point. One of the steps in the plan is normally a reminder to all internal team members, though you might see media on staff remember our policy, to your point.
So, as a question, that came through as far as what level of specificity do these plans have? We've seen, especially and they use the example of Hurricane Helene, that, communities seeing potentially what are once in a lifetime type of events of, roads being washed out and widespread cell phone, being disabled. How specific typically do you see these plans, or are the plans written in a more generalized manner, trying to address those potential crises?
I think of it kind of like if you think about like the bridge in Star Trek, and everybody's got their roles, and intent is to understand the variables, and then everybody adapt and respond and communicate those variables. So our plans aren't as specific to say, if phone lines are down, this is what you do. They are specific to say, okay, what is going on? Capture all the things we need to understand and we need to build around, and then that's what we'll do. And I think the difference in the roles helps support that, because people are laser focused on a specific element of what the organization needs to continue to function. So I just think about it kind of like the terms of the Starship Enterprise, and as you go around the room to the different stations on the bridge, and everybody's like, hey, shields are down. That's what this is. It's understanding the variables at play, and then how do we build a cohesive response around it. It's not so much about the granular go to page 103 to look up what we do when this happens.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think you really have to be able to be nimble and agile in your response. And so I think, if anything, because we can't possibly predict every scenario, we can't plan for every scenario. So as you're doing the training for the incident command team, really leaning into those roles, as you mentioned, Brian, but then helping people understand, how do we flex and adapt? How do we be nimble? How do we be agile? How do we respond in real time? And really, what is that assessment piece? How do we really understand what's happening in real time so that we can react and respond as much as possible, and knowing what your resources are? Who do we pull on for different pieces? And then I think you certainly can plan for what you anticipate to be the most frequent, right? If we know that we live in a certain climate, we're going to have these certain events at a higher percentage, plan for those. But there's no way that you can plan for everything. So how do you really focus in on that agility?
Agree with all of that. It's about the relationships and trusting everyone else on the bridge. But also knowing, if I'm at such and such control with however we're adapting, from a comms perspective, okay, I'm responsible for the internet and the whatever. You've got your list of things where you need to take what's being adapted and make sure that everything under your purview is taken care of appropriately. So totally agree with all of that. The one exception I would say is sometimes for reputational crises, which is a different thing. You can really think through and scenario plan pretty specifically there.
So if an organization was going to, I said, start from scratch, they have no plans currently, what would be, I guess, the steps you would recommend they take in beginning to build kind of a crisis management plan, both from an operational standpoint as well as a communications standpoint?
Let operations go first, because it should and does.
I think from an operational perspective, you really have to think about what your key risks are and start there, right? And really looking to, I think the other thing too is you can look to peers, right? There's a lot of things in healthcare that are similar risks. And so there's no need to necessarily reinvent the wheel. And so I think that's the good news, is you probably don't actually have to start from scratch. You can use lessons learned from other organizations or partner with someone to learn how they've approached things and then adapt it to your organization. But really looking at what those key risks are, especially keeping your patients at the center. What are the things that could dramatically interrupt patient care? Starting with the planning there and then building out from that, I think, is really important. Thinking about continuity planning, again, what are those key areas where you want to incorporate this business continuity plans? And I would say really starting with getting the right team. If you have the right team, you really can plan for everything. But as we've talked about, really identifying who those key individuals are, what are the key roles, how do you really start to build out that team is really important. And then you can go through the logistics of some of the planning pieces.
I think ensuring the effort is resourced appropriately is key. To me, it seems like one of those things where you either commit to as an organization or you don't. There's not really a good in between. And I think the bigger the organization, the more resources are required to stay consistent and have a good plan in place that is going to function when and if something goes wrong. But there's a lot of just coordination work that goes on in the background to make sure that people are trained, to make sure that we have, as somebody leaves the organization, who are we renaming to fill that spot in that team? So there's tons of tools out there, but it's going to require somebody that's going to own it. You got to be clear on who's on first. And then I personally would want executive buy-in all the way to the top to say, okay, if we're going to put this command center structure in place, we need to allow it to function the way it's designed if and when a disaster happens. And I think without that executive buy-in, you run the risk of, we've done all this work to build this, and now here comes this person on the executive team through that and disrupts the whole thing. And that's not a good use of time either.
100%. I totally agree. And to Amanda's point, luckily this is not an area where this is not a competitive area of the business. And so leaning into peers, finding through associations, whether it's through the American College of Healthcare Executives or SHSMD or whatever. I mean, you can find all kinds of sample ICT operational plans, as well as communications plans to get started, and reaching out to peers and asking questions like, what's gone wrong? Which template did you start with? All of those things. Because it's nothing worse than staring at a blank page. But I don't think at this day and age you really need to do that.
And maybe kind of keying off that, Kathy, what are some of the resources you would recommend people consider, either organizational or kind of websites out there, if you were wanting to get more involved in this crisis kind of management space? Where would you recommend people go for those resources?
That is a great question. If it's for communications specifically, PRSA has a crisis communications cohort that has a lot of great information. But so far as overall, I don't know if there's one best practice. This is the go-to website that I would recommend or that I've run across. I really think that learning from peers in your space, finding peer organizations that are similar size, similar region that that you can lean into and develop relationships with to kind of gut check where you're going is the best place to start.
Amanda, Brian, any thoughts on, do you have any resources you would recommend?
No, I agree with Kathy. I don't think there's necessarily a single resource. I think really being just tied into some of those multiple channels, your professional organizations are also always a great place to start. I think there are some resources out there through the federal government too, thinking about, FEMA and some of those types of things just for preparedness. And there's a lot out there, and I think it can be really overwhelming. So that's where I think if people are starting on this journey, learning from other organizations that, as Kathy mentioned, are similar, have similar in your area or things like that can also be really helpful.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add, Andrew. I think that Kathy and Amanda are spot on.
So over the last several years, with probably COVID being the biggest one, we've seen these crisis situations lasting longer and longer. Maybe in the past it was, a few days, maybe a week, but now we're talking about months and even years in kind of a crisis response. So, what should you be thinking, or an organization, what should they be thinking about as to how do you kind of return to normal? Kind of get out of that incident command kind of mode and kind of return back to normal operations, empowering kind of the boots on the ground to be autonomous in their role.
I'll just use the pandemic as an example of, there was a period where we had to understand what COVID was and how we treat it and what we're going to do, and just all the questions that had to get answered. But then at some point along that, it was the acknowledgement, okay, this isn't going away. We're going to have to continue to treat these folks. We now have updated our systems and processes appropriately. We understand our volumes. So to me, it's what is that juncture where you say, this is now just part of ongoing operations, and we need to start this transition from crisis support command center port to making sure that our operational leaders have what they need. And I think it's just whatever time is needed to make that jump between what is the command center doing to support the organization that we need those operational leaders to pick up now in this space. That's really how it's looked for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Brian. And I think we have to go into it as leaders knowing that that's not always going to be a clear demarcation, right? It's not like, okay, today's the last day of COVID. We're done with that. So really just having those ways, again, how are you monitoring the environment? How are you checking in with how things are going, monitoring your data, looking at different pieces like that, so that you can kind of gradually stand down incident command. I don't think it's like a turn it off, flip a switch type of situation when you've been in those long-term processes. One of the things we found is that people get very dependent on the incident command structure when you're in a long-term crisis like that. And so especially coming out of the formal response to the COVID pandemic, we found that we had a lot of leaders in the environment that struggled with returning to how do I lead when I don't have someone telling me what to do? And so really transitioning, you might need some leader development for people. You might have leaders that are new to their role that came in during the crisis, especially when it's longer term. And so what does it look like to have more autonomy in their role, and how can they make decisions? And so sometimes you have to really look at like a decision-making matrix, or, as you transition out of incident command, what decisions are being returned to what level and how do they make those? And those are some things that were an aha for us as we transitioned out of the COVID pandemic. And you can't just turn it off and say, okay, incident command's done, return to normal business. How do you really help with that kind of slower transition?
I agree with both of those. I think another consideration when you're in a longer term crisis like COVID, or like a long-term cyber event, is we talked about fatigue of the incident of people in incident command, but we all remember the fatigue of the day-to-day worker, especially clinical workers, and that during that time, and the messaging fatigue. Like if I see the word COVID one more time, I'm going to lose it. So being thoughtful in your communications and thoughtful in the resources that are being provided to your workforce are super important. And maybe that becomes part of the incident command transition is, okay, we need to make sure that this is an area we haven't really worried about before, beyond our operations, beyond our comms, who's going to be responsible for our culture and for the well-being of, on a different level, the well-being of our staff. Those were super important considerations, as we all saw recently. You're muted, Andrew.
Yes. So we talked a little bit about kind of educating your staff and running through drills and kind of tabletop exercises. What is the recommendation as far as best practices for doing that? And who do you include in some of those education and tabletop exercise? Do you include external organizations such as fire, police, other entities outside the four walls of the organization?
I'm happy to take a start at this one and then pass it along. So I will say we found an approach to regular frequency being very helpful. So we have a monthly emergency preparedness day where we cascade information throughout all levels, all the way down to our frontline clinical teams. And so there's a different theme each month so that we can help people understand what their resources are and what the response would be for each of those. Each of those days includes a smaller mock exercise so that people can understand what it would look like in order to respond to the specific emergency. And then we do also have at regular intervals more of those broad scale kind of tabletop exercises. And that's where we really engage with our external partners, because I do think it's really important to think about what would that coordination look like, right? What do they bring to the table? How do we understand what their response plans are and how they would approach the crisis? How does that fit in with our response plans? How do we need to maybe adjust or augment? What does the communication look like between coordinating agencies? So I do think that is a really important function.
We participate in a couple of externally focused sessions a year with multiple health systems. And then internal to the organization, I think we offer 2 fairly significant tabletop exercises over the course of the year, where we extend it to the entire organization and target those that are signed up for these roles, so that we can talk through real life emergency type responses. I think one of the mock situations was a Lifeline helicopter crashes on the rooftop of the hospital. What do you then do and respond to it? And then in addition, our everybody that functions as an AOD is required to re-up their annual training and certification in the emergency command center system.
I'm so glad you said that, because there is a difference in you're going to be dealing a lot more with those external, with fire, police, with National Guard, with departments of health. If you're the level 1 trauma center in your area, So, and just like we were talking about, it's important not to have in your plan call the VP of operations, but knowing, oh, the police need to call their Bob or whatever, and building those relationships is super important. So meeting regularly, even if it's not a drill every time, meeting regularly, just updating each other on potential risks we see on upcoming events where something may occur is really important. And so far as communications drills, we recommend to our clients at least once a year to go through that more real-time drill, and then an additional at least once a year we go through a tabletop drill alongside the ICT.
So as we kind of start to close out the discussion today, what would be the kind of one or two things or piece of advice that you would give to a healthcare executive that is dealing with a crisis within the organization?
If you're in the midst of a crisis, a couple of things. One is it feels like the whole world is on top of your chest in the middle of a crisis, and to whenever possible step back and really assess. We talked about this with social media, but really with any crisis, how big is this crisis? Really, how impactful is it on the organization? And give yourself some perspective as needed, and also to trust that you've hired good and smart people who are doing the right things, and trust the processes you have in place, that that they've been put there and that they will work, and where they won't work, they'll be fixed.
I think that is so well said, Kathy. I think it can feel like you're all alone when you are the leader who's responsible for helping to navigate through that crisis, or if it's primarily focused in your area or having an outside impact on your area. So I think really making sure that you can trust the team, and being able to take, as we talked about before, being able to take breaks and to step away so that you really can come back with that clear head and trust the process, trust the team, so you can make the right decision. I think also too, sometimes really getting your mindset right. A lot of times with a crisis, we have that immediate response, there's that adrenaline rush, but then how do you kind of settle into the marathon mode? And so what does it look like to really have that holistic perspective, and to take care of yourself, to take care of the team, so that ultimately you can deliver on what you need to deliver on?
And I would just add, just on the same kind of note of collaboration, of don't try to own too much. I think things go sideways when you don't let other people own the things in their space. And even with good intent, try to resolve an issue that you need to let one of your peers resolve. I think it's better to err on the side of let's hold folks accountable versus just jumping in and problem solving in other people's space.
On accountability, though, I will say yes, 100%. But this is a yes, and as you're trusting and letting folks do what they need to do, that's not second guessing afterward, or being digging into your kindest, most wonderful, supportive self as a leader is really what is needed from leaders in a crisis situation. As you're interacting and getting updates from the ICT, absolutely ask the important questions, ask the deep questions, how things are going to respond. But when there's disagreement, remembering the stress that not just you're under, but that everybody's under, and treating each other with kindness. It sounds so trite, but it's super important in a crisis situation.
Thanks, Kathy. I think as we look, I mean, there's no shortage of crises within healthcare, and if you're within healthcare long enough, it's likely you're going to be at the lead of one of these issues. And so, we hope today that some of the lessons learned and thoughts that were shared really provide at least some guidance and framework and for you to think about as you're progressing in your career and your role within your organization. So just want to thank Amanda, Brian, and Kathy for participating in today's panel. I think lots of great insights for our members that they heard today. Also, just want to again thank our sponsors, Blue and Company, our platinum sponsor, HEPI, our gold sponsors, Cornerstone and Access Telecare, our silver sponsors, Arc Design and Ascension St. Vincent, our bronze sponsor, Hagerman Construction, and our education sponsor, Walden University. Also, would like to put in a plug for those that are looking for education credits. ACHU of Indiana will be putting on a 6-credit in-person event September 18th. So more information to come, but please, if you have an opportunity or needing these credits and education sessions, or even if you're not, I think it'll be a good event to see your peers and to get some great education at the same time. So with that, I will turn it over to Nancy to wrap us up.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and just change my view here so I can see a little better. All right, great. I had put the evaluation link in the chat. I'm going to do that again before we end, but I'm going to go ahead real quick here and just close us out by thanking our moderator and our panelists and our chapter ACHE of Indiana for an outstanding event. We had lots and lots of questions and discussion in the chat, and it was really, really great to see. Again, the evaluation will be in the chat in just a second. So if you can make sure you answer that. If you don't grab it from the chat, it is in the learning management system and will be there for 7 days. We really appreciate your feedback. If you've attended today's event in full entirety and we have your name as you registered, you should see the 1.5 hours of virtual interactive education credit post within the next 10 days, possibly sooner, and the recording will be available in 2 days. But that concludes the session, which we do copyright in 2025 by the American College of Healthcare Executives. All rights are reserved, and we thank you everyone for joining us today and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. I did put that link in the chat if you want to grab it. And thank you, Jean. Appreciate that. Have a great day.